I'm going to talk about some speakers in this video that I would say are all good to great speakers. They all have good neutrality, but with varying degrees. You know, maybe there's a mid-range scoop, maybe there's a tweeter boost or a tweeter cut or something like that. And they all factor into how the speaker sounds in your room. And for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to talk about manufacturer specs like is it a three-way or a two-way? How big is it? What's the weight? I'm going to let you look that up if you want to later, okay? Also, before I get started, I want to define a couple things. All right. On axis is when the speaker is pointed directly at you. Off axis is any angle away from you. Toe out would be going away from you toward the walls. Toe in would be crossing in front of you at the listening position. When I talk about distance from the wall, I'm talking about from the back of the speaker to the wall because that is something that makes sense. So let's start with the lower price and we're going to go to the higher price. First one up, the KEF Concerto Q Meta retails for about $12.99 a pair. Sensitivity is at about 84.2 decibels at 2.83 volts, 1 meter. That's the standard I'm going to be using. So all comparisons are going to be used at the same standard. This speaker to me is a class leader. I would say it's probably the best value speaker on this list. It has really good neutrality. So if you're looking for a speaker that has really good on and off axis performance, and you're looking for a speaker that would go maybe in a smaller room that's highly reflective, this is a really good choice. And the reason for that is because, again, the on versus off axis response, they pretty much match. They're very well matched. I would say that this speaker is a good option for those of you who maybe have a smaller room. Now, the one thing about the speaker in that regard is that you do want to give it some space away from the wall. So you don't want to put it right up next to the wall. Whereas the R3 Meta, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, its bigger brother, is designed to be placed closer to a wall. But this one's not. The reason I say that it might be a good option for a smaller room is because its on versus off axis response is pretty similar. On axis, again, pointed directly at you versus off axis, the sounds that are going away from the listening position. The off axis sounds hit the wall, they reflect, and they come back to you in the listening position. You want those sounds to sound very similar to the sound that's coming at you first, that's hitting your ears first and not reflected. If those sounds are not similar, there's going to be a gap in the tonality and it's going to make you go, that doesn't sound right. Something's a little bit off there. Typically, that's going to happen in the crossover region from a mid-range to a tweeter, usually in like the 2 to 4 kilohertz region. You're going to notice that, it sounds kind of subdued through that area, or you're going to hear it as a bump in the lower treble where it's going to sound a bit sibilant, where those S's are just too hot. That's typically what you have when you have poor on versus off axis performance. And most of the speakers in this list, I think they all have good performance in that regard. But I'm making that distinction because in addition to the good linearity directly on axis and off axis with the reflections, this speaker is a little bit narrow at about plus or minus 50 degrees in its horizontal radiation pattern. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I just mean if you're looking at the speaker dead on, it radiates to about 50 degrees this way and about 50 degrees that way, making 100 degrees hemisphere. I almost didn't think of that word. And that is what I would consider kind of normal for most speakers. I say a little bit narrow because personally, I like a speaker that's around 60 to 70 degrees or about 120 to 140 hemispherical radiation pattern. That means that there's a wider berth of sound that's going to hit the walls and come back to the listening position. And the reason that I like a little bit wider soundstage radiation or radiation pattern is because, kind of gave it away, it tends to make the soundstage sound a little bit wider because of those reflections. Now, you can't get that effect if the off-axis response or the radiation of that speaker is not similar to the on-axis. If they sound different, then not only does the tonality shift cause you to go, what? The soundstage will also collapse at the far end. So you want that cohesiveness between the direct sound and the reflected sound. Again, this speaker radiates at about plus or minus 50 degrees horizontally, but it also does it vertically. So you have a vertical region that you can stand up and walk around. Basically, your head doesn't have to be in a vise. You can kind of sit up, you can sit down, or again, you can stand up and walk around. A couple other reasons I like this speaker is because there's a nice little bit of a mid-bass thump around 100 hertz. So it's not perfectly flat through that region. It's not perfectly linear. There's a little bit of a bump right there. And I do like that. It just gives a little bit more sense of kick drum. However, there's a mild upper mid-bass dip around 200 hertz that might also take away a little bit of that. It's going to take a little bit of that punch away. So there's a little bit of that trade-off. Now I'm going to show you what I'm talking about in the next graphic, but I'm going to keep going, okay? Hang on. Bass extension in the room is around 40 to 50 hertz. You're going to want to bring this speaker off the wall a little bit because it doesn't have a scoop like the R3 Meta has. I would recommend you position it directly aiming toward you, or maybe like 10 degrees out, just toed out a little bit horizontally. And also you want to make sure that your head, well, maybe you don't need to make sure, but ideally your head or your ears are going to be lined up with that tweeter. Now you can deviate from this a little bit more than you can with other designs, other three-way designs that are not coaxial like this KEF Concerto Q Meta is. But still the ideal position is going to be about 0 to 10 degrees to either side of the speaker and above and below it. And here's the data kind of explaining what I'm talking about. I said it's about 40 hertz in-room extension. This is that mild upper mid-bass dip. Around here at around 100 hertz, there's a little bit of a bump relative to this dip. And then on the higher frequency, you can see that the off axis in red at 30 degrees tracks very nicely to the on axis estimated in-room response. And if you're not familiar with seeing this, I'm gonna give you a very quick crash course. This is captured using a lot of other data points that is captured using my Klippel near field scanner. So this scanner goes around the speaker and it captures all the sound at all different points, all the way around the speaker, like you see in this video. Once it's done, it can basically build the field of sound. And pro audio people use this all the time. Those stadiums that you go to, they need this data. Home audio is starting to kind of come around to see the importance of this data, but there's a lot of people who don't believe in it. I encourage you all to try to do some research on it. I'm just going to leave it there, okay? So what we can do with this anechoic data is we can determine how the speaker is most likely going to sound in typical rooms based on the reflections and the direct sound. From those reflections and direct sound, we get the estimated in-room response, which is what you see here. Next speaker is the Wharfedale Linton 85. Now, this is the original or regular version of the Linton, and it retails currently for about $1,500 per pair with the stand. This is a speaker that you want to make sure that you use it with the grill on. It was designed to be used with the grill on. If you take that grill off the speaker, you're going to change the response and it's not going to sound as good. So keep the grill on with the speaker when you're doing critical listening. Bass extension down to about 40 hertz in room. There's a pretty, I don't want to say big, but it's also not mild in relative terms either, but there's a dip in the mid-range area centered around 1 kilohertz or so. So what that's going to do is it's going to make the speaker sound kind of warm because it's going to have a little bit more mid-range emphasis, maybe a little bit treble emphasis as well. Not so much the treble, but more the mid-range because of that dip around 1K. It's primarily, though, going to make it sound like the speakers have a recess or maybe a lack of attack, or a lack of dynamics or a lack of presence due to that dip. So that's how it's going to sound to you in your room, most likely. You're also going to want to bring the speaker out from the wall. I would say 2 to 3 feet, or what is that? 0.3 to 0.6 to 1 meter. Okay. I would recommend that because of the roll-off profile that I'm about to show you in a second. Its horizontal radiation is about 70 degrees wide, so it's pretty wide and I like that. But vertically, you need to make sure that you're on that axis of the tweeter because it's only about plus or minus 10 degrees of forgiveness there. This is the estimated in-room response for it, and I'm showing you grill on versus grill off. But you can see that with the grill on, the response is a little bit smoother in this higher frequency area. If you take the grill off, you're going to get a bump in the sibilance region. But either way you go, you can see that there's a pretty wide dip around, I said about 1 kilohertz. It could be 900 hertz if you wanted to do that. And it's about maybe 3 to 4 decibels in depth. So that's going to result in a dip that sounds soft or lack of dynamics. The bass extension is going to be good to about 40 hertz in room. And every speaker on this list can benefit from a subwoofer. Just keep that in mind. The Wharfedale Aura 2 retails currently for about $2,000 per pair. Sensitivity is about 87 decibels. Now, the thing about the Wharfedale Aura 2 that's very noticeably different is the vertical radiation pattern is really narrow and its high frequency directly on axis, if it's pointed directly at you, is going to sound a bit boosted if you're in a larger room. If you're in a smaller room where there's more reflections, you won't notice that boost as much. But if you don't have as many reflections, you're going to notice that boost in the higher frequency region and it could sound a bit bright. But in a typical room, smaller to medium sized typical room with side walls that are somewhat nearby, let's say within a couple meters or so, this speaker should sound more neutral than when it doesn't have sidewalls that are within that distance. Bass is a bit more subdued on this particular speaker, and I'm going to show you why in a second. Its radiation pattern horizontally is pretty wide. I think it's about plus or minus 70 degrees or so, give or take. So I like that. But in the high frequency, it starts to narrow up pretty quickly. So the mid-range is going to sound wide, but the treble may not sound as wide. In-room extensions down to about 40 hertz, and I do suggest that you pull the speaker out from the wall about half a meter to a meter at least to give that speaker room to breathe. Now, if you wanted to put this closer to the wall to get more mid-bass action, that 50 to 80 hertz region, and bump that up some, you can. But I would recommend that you bring the speaker out from the wall and then use like a tonal balance if you want to on the bass, just your tonal balance knobs, and bump that up to give you a little bit more bass. This is the estimated in-room response. So you can see I'm saying 40 hertz in-room extensions. It's kind of in the ballpark of that. And this right here is really where I'm talking about the bass being a bit subdued. Now, most of the other speakers that you're going to see, they're going to follow this trend line. And the trend line represents what I heard in the room. This speaker, however, kind of flattens off at around 100 hertz and starts to roll off there instead of increasing in output and then slowly rolling off. There is a bit of a bump in the 1 to 2 kilohertz region, and that's going to sound like it has a bit more attack or maybe even dynamicism. The MoFi SourcePoint 8 retails for about $2,100, and like the KEF Concerto Q that I mentioned earlier, it also would work well in a smaller room where maybe you have sidewall reflections close, because I don't want to say because it's coaxial, but it's a good coaxial. Some coaxials are just garbage, right? But this is a good coaxial like that KEF that I talked about. So the direct sound versus the reflected sound, they're going to sound very similar. The one area that this speaker seems to fall short compared to some of these other speakers in this list is that below about 50 hertz, it falls off pretty quickly. And in terms of dynamic range at the lower frequencies, you're going to lose that. So I would almost recommend that you have to use a subwoofer with the speaker if you have any content that gets down below 50 hertz. If you tend to find that most of your music is maybe like rock or pop or something like that, then you might be able to get away without needing a subwoofer. But typically, I would say that if a speaker doesn't get down to 40 hertz on its own, a subwoofer is probably a necessity. That might be the only drawback to this particular speaker, and it's probably why they made the 888, the SourcePoint 888 tower speaker that gets down to like the 30 hertz region. But continuing on, the only other detriment about the speaker is there's a small itty bitty little cut around 500 hertz, and it may take away from the fullness. Now, honestly, I don't recall hearing that at all with these speakers. I think overall, I thought these speakers were fantastic. It was just that they were limited in low frequency output and overall SPL output. The radiation pattern of the speaker is about plus or minus 60 degrees, so 120 degrees horizontally and even vertically. So it's another one of those speakers where you can stand up and walk around the room. You don't have to worry about keeping your head in a vise. Whereas all the speakers on this list that are not coaxial, so they're not KEF or they're not MoFi, they are all going to require a bit more careful placement with your ears, where you're going to make sure that your ears are at the high frequency or the treble position. Yeah, the tweeter position. And now we can see the data. Here's that where it just rolls off at 50 hertz pretty quickly. Very mild 500 hertz mid-range dip. I got to be honest, I'm not sure if you're going to hear that, but I'm trying to be objective here. And then going on to the good directivity allows for wider placement. So just like the KEF, where you can kind of sit not anywhere you want to, but you have wider radiation pattern that's very good in terms of on axis versus off axis, you're going to have the ability to sit side to side. Okay, that's good enough. Moving on to the KEF R3 Meta at about $2,200 a pair. Now, the biggest difference, in my opinion, between this and the other KEF and even the MoFi that I just showed you is its placement capability. This KEF has what they call an extended bass shelf profile, where the bass starts to roll off and then it kind of picks back up and then it rolls off steeply again. That design is intended for you to be able to place the speaker closer to a boundary. So if you have a small room and you're not able to bring the speaker out away from the walls, you can do that with this design. Whereas that MoFi that I just talked about and the KEF Concerto Q Meta, you're going to want to bring those out from the wall. If you don't put the speaker closer to a wall, the bass is going to sound thin. So if you put it where typical audiophile types like to bring their speakers way out from the wall, that bass is going to sound thin because it's designed to be placed closer to a wall. Keep that in mind. Overall, the neutrality of the speaker is really good. However, I will say that if you point the speaker directly at the listening position, you might find it to be a little bit hot in the treble region. Sensitivity is at about 86 decibels. In-room extension, again, is going to be, it's going to vary depending on where you place it. But if you place it near a wall, you're going to be able to get down to about 40 or 50 hertz. The radiation pattern of this speaker is also at about plus or minus 50 horizontally and about plus or minus 50 vertically. So just like the KEF and just like the MoFi that I talked about previously, you have more room to stand up, to walk around, not head in a vise. This is the estimated in-room response. And see this right here on this bass region. Now, most of the other speakers that you're going to see here are going to go right through here and then kind of fall off through there. And the reason that this speaker has this is what I just said a minute ago, the extended bass shelf. So what would happen is if you were to take another speaker that had this kind of roll off where it goes up through here and then down, and you put that speaker near a wall, it's going to sound boomy and resonant in the mid-bass region. This speaker has a profile that allows you to put it near the wall that won't sound boomy or resonant. And otherwise, neutrality is good. You just note that I said 0 degrees might sound a little bit bright if pointed directly at you. So my recommendation would maybe to be tone them out about 10 degrees or so. The Wharfedale Super Linton just came out. Currently retails for about $2,500 with the stands, but I think that's an intro price that's going to go up to $3,000 with the stand. So if you're looking at this speaker, I would go ahead and jump on it while you can. Another speaker that you have to use the grill, just like the Wharfedale Linton non-super, so the regular Linton, this speaker was designed to be used with the grill on. Sensitivity is about 3 decibels higher at about 88 decibels compared to the regular Linton at about 85 decibels. And the other difference about this speaker beyond the sensitivity is it, like the KEF R3 Meta we just looked at, has an extended bass shelf profile that is designed to allow you to place it a little bit closer to the wall. So if you like the Linton a lot and you're like, I don't really want to bring a speaker way out from the wall, you can go to this one and you can put this closer to the wall just the same as you can with the KEF R3 Meta. Now, its profile isn't quite the same as the KEF R3 Meta, so you can't put it right next to a wall. I would recommend maybe like a foot or about 1/3 of a meter off the wall, but you should be good with that. Overall neutrality of the speaker is really good. There still is a little bit of a recess in the mid-range area that I'm going to point out to you on the next graphic. The radiation pattern is about plus or minus 70 degrees side to side, but vertically, you're going to need to make sure that you're on that tweeter axis because it's pretty limited at about maybe plus or minus 10 degrees or so. All right, so here we go with the estimated in-room response. Bass extension's about 40 hertz in room, but notice I said might not sound as full in the mid-bass if not placed near a wall. So same thing with the R3 Meta we just talked about. If you bring this speaker out from the wall, this little dip right in this region right here is going to make it sound maybe a little bit thin compared to the regular Linton and bass, but that's because it's designed to be placed a little bit closer to the wall. Now, this is nothing new. Potentially recessed mid-range sound right here. So that's about, 2 decibels or so right through there. So it could sound a bit recessed and not forward. If you want that kind of pulled back sound a little bit in the mid-range, this will have that quality to it. But otherwise, it's much more neutral than the Linton that we talked about previously. So that does it for my review, my list. I don't know. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer. But I got to be honest, I don't have a lot of time these days, so I might just miss it. But I still appreciate you asking any questions if you have them. Hopefully, somebody else in the community can help you with that answer. Okay? All right. I will talk to y'all later. Take care and have a good one.